With a GoPro, you can take fantastic shots. However, the many setting options can be a bit overwhelming in the beginning. That's why today we'll take a look at how you can optimally set up your GoPro Hero 11 to achieve the best possible results. Before we take a closer look at the video settings, you should make sure that the controls are set to Pro and the video mode is set to highest. You can find both settings by opening the menu and swiping to the left. Today, we will focus exclusively on the optimal video quality. There will be separate tutorials on the photo and time-lapse mode. In the default configuration of the video mode, you will find the shortcut for slow motion in the upper left corner, the shortcut for the field of view in the lower left corner, the shortcut for the type of stabilization in the upper right corner, and the shortcut for the digital zoom in the lower right corner. If you tap on the main button at the bottom in the middle, the settings menu opens. There are already 5 presets here: standard, full frame, activity, cinematic and ultra slow-mo. The presets are a great feature because they let you switch between different settings very quickly. I'll now change the default settings to what I think is optimal. To do this, I tap on a pen to the right of standard. Now you see the actual settings menu. Let's start with the most important settings, the settings for resolution and frame rate. It makes sense to consider these two settings together because the frame rate options also depend on the resolution. At the top you can choose the resolution and at the bottom the frame rate. The highest possible resolution is 5.3K, and if you want the absolute best image quality, then you should choose the resolution of 5.3K. Only with this resolution you get the best possible image quality with the Hero 11. Already in 4K, the image quality is noticeably worse. Please note that 16:9 is selected in the first line. In addition to 16:9, 4:3 and 8:7 would also be available. A typical video file has an aspect ratio of 16:9. If you're shooting 4:3 or 8:7, you will find black bars on the left and right side of your image, but the field of view will be extended at the top and bottom. You'll have to adjust the framing in post, but you'll have more flexibility at the top and bottom. This can be especially interesting for POV shots, for example if you use a helmet mount. The almost square 8:7 format should also allow you to decide after the recording if you want to use the shot for a typical horizontal clip or if you want to use it for a vertical video that you can share on social media or TikTok. Even though the 8:7 format is particularly interesting, you should only use it if you really need it. I choose 16:9 here. You should also know that 5.3K is not always the best choice. In low light, you get much better results with 4K. This is obviously due to the way GoPro reduces image noise. I also use 4K for slow motion shots, but more about that later. Now we come to the frame rate. Under 5.3K, you can choose between 24, 30 and 60 frames per second. All 3 frame rates have their advantages and disadvantages. If you plan to edit your videos, you should know the frame rate you want to use to create your project before shooting. Ideally, your footage should have the same frame rate as your projects. Choose 24 frames per second if you want to create a cinematic look. All professional movies are created at this frame rate. The disadvantage of this frame rate is that fast movements can look a bit choppy, especially when there is a lot of light and you don't use ND filters. 30 frames per second look less cinematic but smoother. 60 frames per second look even smoother and allow you to create 40% slow motion. So apart from slow motion, I would generally recommend 24 frames per second if you want to achieve a cinematic look. 30 frames per second if you prefer a smoother look. For shots underwater, motovlogging or POV shots when doing sports, for example when skiing, I recommend 60 frames per second because the shot looks most natural then. Personally, I opt for 24 frames per second most of the time. If you live in the PAL region, that would be 25 frames per second. If you want to shoot spectacular slow motion footage, I recommend reducing the resolution to 4K and shooting at 120 frames per second. This allows you to create up to 5 times slow motion in 4K. If you want it even slower, then reduce the resolution to 2.7K and select 240 frames per second. So you can create up to 10 times slow motion. But I would only recommend it if you really need it. 4K 120 looks great. 2.7K 240 on the other hand leads to a significantly worse image quality. But of course you don't always need slow motion and it doesn't make sense to shoot with high frame rates all the time. Especially in low light, you should rather avoid higher frame rates, because in low light conditions, less frames per second are advantages. Therefore, you should use a separate preset for slow motion. That way, you can quickly switch back and forth. As we saw before, there is already a preset for slow motion. It's called Ultra Slow-Mo. I prefer a setting of 4K 4K 120 instead of 2.7K 240. Of course, you could also create an additional preset via the plus. By the way, if you are interested in which poles or other GoPro accessories I use, have a look at the links in the video description. Now let's have a look at the digital lens or the field of view. There is now a relatively large selection here. You have the choice between wide, linear, linear with horizon lock, super view and hyper view. Wide is the standard field of view of the GoPro. In the case of linear, the fisheye effect is removed. The image has to be cropped for this, but the distortions are reduced. If you select linear with horizon lock, the camera will also keep the horizon straight to prevent tilted shots. Linear with horizon lock also leads to an improved stabilization. With super view, the field of view is extended at the top and bottom. For this, a 4:3 aspect ratio shot is taken and then stretched from the camera on the left and right to the outer side. This results in very strong distortions at the left and right edges, but you get a larger field of view at the top and bottom. The same basically applies to hyperview, except that here the field of view is even bigger, the distortions also increase. Superview and hyperview are, in my opinion, very interesting options for POV shots. But personally, I almost always use the wide field of view on the GoPro. I often use the camera for sports or travel. In these cases, I consider the particularly wide field of view of the GoPro to be an advantage. If distortions really bother me with a certain shot, they can also be removed in post. If you don't like the GoPro fisheye look in general, I would recommend linear with horizon lock. That way you can easily create very steady and cinematic shots without distortion. With the Hero 11, you can set 2 levels of stabilization. You generally have the choice between on and boost. The standard stabilization already works great. Boost compensates for even stronger movements. However, the image is cropped by 25 to 30%. In the standard setting, however, there is only a crop of about 10%. Since I want to avoid a strong crop under boost, because I want to maintain a wide field of view, I normally choose on under stabilization. With the Hero 11, auto boost was introduced. It automatically activates boost when there are strong movements in the course of the shot. Here you can see auto boost in action. This can be particularly interesting for very long shots and when you don't know exactly how bumpy it will be. Under scheduled capture, you can schedule the exact time of a capture. And with duration, you can set a time limit. With scheduled capture and duration, you can, for example, schedule a time-lapse capture of the sunrise and let the camera take it automatically without getting up in the morning. In video mode, I personally have hardly any use for both features. Hindsight is a very interesting feature. If you activate it, the camera will capture the 15 or 30 seconds before you press the shutter button. This of course requires that the GoPro is recording continuously. That way you can prevent missing a particularly important moment. However, this feature will of course cause your battery to drain much faster, so make sure you don't accidentally activate it when you don't need it. With the timer, you can delay the start of the recording by 3 or 10 seconds. This in turn is helpful, for example, if you want to capture yourself. And under zoom, you can digitally zoom into the image. Since this is a digital zoom, the image quality will be diminished. According to GoPro, zooming further improves stabilization. Personally, I never use this feature. Now let's come to the Protune settings. These are the more advanced settings. The first setting refers to the color depth. This determines how many gradations of the individual colors the recording has. You need this mainly if you want to color grade your shot. As I often do this, and today it is about the best possible image quality, I activate 10-bit. The next setting refers to the video bitrate. Simply put, this is about how much video data is transferred per second. A high bitrate has a positive effect on the image quality, but leads to larger files, so your SD card will fill up faster. Again, it's all about the highest possible image quality, so I choose high. However, you should know that this will make the file significantly bigger, and the difference is not always clearly visible. Under shutter, you can set exposure time manually. This only makes sense if you're using ND filters or maybe in low light. By default, I use the automatic. Under exposure value compensation, you can set whether the camera's automatic should expose a little darker or brighter. It makes sense to set a slightly negative value of -0.5 for example. This prevents the camera from overexposing bright areas in the image. In post, it is easy to brighten up shadows. However, areas that are too bright and burnt out cannot be saved. White balance is about how cool or warm the image looks. Depending on the type of light, the white balance changes. The goal should always be that white actually looks white. The automatic of the GoPro works very well here, so I leave this setting on auto. If you take a longer shot, for example when making a longer ride with the bike, you can also set the white balance manually. This prevents the camera from changing the white balance during the recording and ruining your shot. For daylight, for example, a value of approximately 5000 or 5500 is recommended. The ISO value, in simple terms, defines how sensitively the camera reacts to incident light. The higher this value, the brighter the image. At the same time, a higher ISO value results in disturbing image noise. This image noise is very strongly visible, especially from 800 ISO. Therefore, I would set ISO minimum to 100 and ISO maximum to 400. As already mentioned, in 4K the Hero 11 achieves better results in low light. In 4K you can also use ISO 800 if necessary. However, you should not expect miracles here either. The GoPro was simply not made for low light situations. You should take this into account when shooting. Sharpness is a very important setting for me. High sharpness doesn't mean more detail. Rather, the camera adds digital sharpness to the shot to artificially enhance the image. However, the image doesn't look very cinematic and the shot doesn't get a high quality look. I use a sharpness of low here. This makes the image look very soft. I then add some sharpness in post. If you don't plan to edit your footage, I would use medium here. There are 3 color profiles to choose from under color. Natural differs from vibrant mainly in that it has less saturation. It also has slightly more natural colors. With flat, you get a very flat and unsaturated image. Especially in the highlights, a little more detail is preserved. However, it has been shown that with flat, details can also be lost due to the compression in very low contrast areas of the image. For this reason, I prefer the color profile natural on the Hero 11. Here, you could have the camera create additional WAV files to better edit the sound. I set raw audio to off. The GoPro has 3 microphones. Depending on the wind situation, one or the other microphone could be deactivated to reduce the wind noise. You can turn this feature on or off here. I leave the setting at auto. I now apply these Protune settings to my slow motion profile as well, so I can easily switch between standard and slow motion. That was quite a lot of information now. So let us briefly recap. Resolution and frame rate, 5.3K for optimal quality, 24 frames per second for a cinematic look, 30 if you prefer a smoother look, 60 frames per second for underwater shots, moto vlogging and other sports POV shots, 4K for better image quality in low light and 4K 120 for great slow motion, digital lens of field of view wide, stabilization on. For Protune, 10-bit on, bitrate high, shutter auto, exposure value compensation -0.5, white balance auto, ISO minimum 100, ISO maximum 400, sharpness low or medium if you don't want to edit your videos, color natural. With that we have optimally set up our GoPro. I wish you much fun with your GoPro. If this video was interesting for you, give me a like as feedback. If you don't have a lot of experience with GoPros, I also recommend you watch the video I made on the most common GoPro beginner mistakes. You'll be surprised. And if you want to support this channel, you can also use the link in the video description and buy me a coffee. There will be more videos about the Hero 11, so stay tuned and until next time.